We must demand that women's health is protected, funded, and prioritized because women's health matters to all of us.
We need people from all walks of life to stand up for women's health research because when we invest in women's health, the benefits ripple across families, communities, and generations.
When we design medicine for only half of the population, we fail everyone. But when we design it for everyone, we can transform the future of health.
This is not a niche topic. This is not a niche market. This is health in general. Women's health is everyone's health.
What our scientists are uncovering right now are things that medicine never knew before.
And women's health is really, it's really the gem to be uncovered in this time.
Let's share data. Let's be part of collaborative research platforms. Let's not move only at the speed of our own organization. Let's join these collective efforts.
The data is clear, the opportunity is massive, and the time to act is now. Good afternoon. I'm Carolee Lee, CEO and founder of WHAM, a nonprofit dedicated to accelerating research and investment in women's health. And I'm delighted to welcome you to what I believe will be a truly energizing and consequential conversation. Autoimmune disease sits at the intersection of immunology, aging, and long-term health. And it's one of the clearest examples of where biology and investment have been misaligned. Nearly 80% of people living with autoimmune disease are women. And yet for decades, the science, the data, and the therapies have not been built with that reality in mind. The result is not only gaps in care, it's missed scientific insight, delayed innovation, unserved patient needs, and a significant untapped market opportunity. As the immune system evolves over time, chronic inflammation becomes a central driver of disease, impacting everything from cardiovascular health to neurodegeneration, and understanding these pathways is essential to extending healthy lifespan. Women's biology offers one of the most powerful and under-leveraged entry points into this conversation. From immune regulation to hormonal signaling to the role of ovarian aging, the connections between inflammation, autoimmunity, and longevity are becoming increasingly clear. And importantly, this is not a niche issue. This is a frontier of science with broad implications for how we understand disease, develop therapies, and invest in the future of health. At WHAM, we focus on one core idea. When you invest in the health of women, you unlock insights that benefit everyone, while also capturing one of the most significant growth opportunities in healthcare. Today's discussion is about where that opportunity is emerging most clearly, where the science is advancing, where the gaps remain, and what can be done across research, clinical development, and capital to accelerate progress in 3, not 30. We are privileged to be joined by exceptional leaders who are living and driving this work forward. I'm honored to be joined by such luminaries in their fields, such as Dr. Sonia Sharma, an assistant professor at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology, one of the leading centers for immune research, Dr. Jennifer Garrison, a neuroscientist and leading voice in ovarian aging and its connection to systemic health and longevity, Dr. Christina Isaacson, a partner in Lightstone Ventures, who brings a critical investment lens to where science is translating into high-impact opportunities, and Dr. Victoria Shanmugam, the director at the NIH Office of Autoimmune Disease Research in the Office of Research on Women's Health. Thank you all for being here. And I'm delighted, Vicki, that you could join us at the last minute, and I apologize. I know many of you are expecting to see Dr. Erica Ullman-Sapphire. Unfortunately, she has a stomach virus, but Dr. Sonia Sharma, who she works very closely with, who's an associate professor, will be joining us. But with that said, I'd love to turn to you, Sonia, because you are involved with one of the world's premier immunology institutes. And LJI has been at the forefront, really, of advancing how we understand immune responses across some of the most complex diseases. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your work specifically in autoimmune disease and how inflammation, I know that you've been working in Alzheimer's and related projects. If you could catch us up as your perspective, with your perspective as an immunologist in this field, I'd be so grateful, and everyone else would love to hear.
Thanks so much, Carolee, and thank you for having me on this really valuable discussion, and really appreciate it. Now, to address the question that you asked me, I'm going to take it a step back and just talk a little bit about La Jolla Institute for Immunology, as you mentioned, where myself and Erica are working alongside 24 other very talented immunologists. And at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology, we focus specifically on studying the relationship and the intricacies of the immune system and how it relates to diseases. Because to put it quite simply, every disease is an immune disease. And that's just because your immune system, which lives in your blood and in your bones and in your tissues, really impacts every single organ system. So kind of like what you mentioned in your introduction, that impacts obviously cardiovascular disease and neurodegeneration and kidney inflammation and all of these diseases, cancer, that we might not typically think about as immune diseases. But we don't even have to make that argument for autoimmune disease, do we? I mean, autoimmune disease is the canonical immune disease. Your immune system has evolved, as you mentioned, with us in order to really do one thing, and that is to attack pathogens. Those pathogens could be bacteria, viruses like SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, or they could be cancer. And it's really designed to wake up and attack those threats, but then it needs to go back to sleep when we don't want it anymore. And that's really where autoimmune diseases come in. It's the inability of our immune system to go to sleep when we need it to go to sleep. And these diseases, which were once considered kind of rare diseases, they're not. They're increasing in incidence, and this is at the heart of women's health, because autoimmune diseases affect women predominantly. 80% of patients today in the US and globally with autoimmune disease are women. And that's, that is a striking figure. Some diseases like Hashimoto's thyroiditis or lupus, they have a skew of 9-1 in women compared to men. Even the more common autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis still have about a 2 to 3%, threefold skew to women to men. Why is this? This is where the problem comes. We don't understand why. And to bring about your question about our research, my research at La Jolla Institute for Immunology and that of some others is to understand how and why that stronger immune system that women seem to have, how it predisposes them to develop conditions like autoimmune diseases. What do we know? Okay, we know that chromosomes matter, that the X chromosome, for example, contains over 1,000 immune genes. And because women have 2 X chromosomes, they naturally have a more boosted immune system and therefore the capacity to develop autoimmune disease. And at La Jolla Institute, we're studying each of these immune genes that's duplicated on the double X that might predispose to autoimmune. We know that estrogen, which is the hormone, is very immune stimulatory, and it acts through multiple levels of genetics, but also metabolism, changing that women have very different metabolism compared to men, and that affects their immune system. So really the research, I feel like, is at such an exciting point, because I could be pessimistic and say, well, we haven't done enough yet, but I could also be optimistic and say, well, there's so much for us to do together to accelerate. So we're really at that point when you mentioned about acceleration. I feel like we're right at that inflection point where there's so much to be learned about how genetics, metabolism, hormones are affecting our immune system in women in order to understand the causes of these diseases, in order to develop better cures. So I'm just really excited, and I just am so happy to chat with my fellow researchers and yourself, because I think it always starts in better communication, and that's what accelerates cures.
Thank you, Sonia. That's such a wonderful way for us to get started. And we're so appreciative of all the work that you and LJI are doing in this field. And it's a perfect segue to Dr. Jennifer Garrison, whose research focuses on how age-related changes in the chemical in the chemical conversation between the ovaries, which you were referring to estrogen in the brain, so I started thinking in that direction, can lead to accelerated aging in females, which is fascinating because I don't think we were talking about this, Jennifer, like even maybe you were about 2 or 3 years ago, but it certainly wasn't in the zeitgeist or on the horizon like it is now. And your work, I think we're all fascinated by to understand why ovaries age before other tissues. And I did not know that, by the way, and that how that knowledge can be used to extend health span in women. So I'm fascinated to build onto Sonia's comments and appreciative of the work that you're doing. Talk to us a little bit about ovarian aging, the immune function, inflammation, and how we can all understand how this biology is really going to open up new pathways for hopefully much healthier lifespan for all of us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carolee. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think that talking about the connections between ovarian function and immune function are super important. And this is a conversation that is relevant to every woman, not just women in midlife and beyond. So I'm a neuroscientist by training, and my work really focused a lot on trying to understand how the brain communicates with the rest of the body outside of wired or signals that travel through nerves. So I spent a lot of time studying what I call the brain's Wi-Fi system, which is essentially just chemicals that travel between the brain and the rest of the body to carry information so that your brain can both set and control your physiology. And really my lab started 11 years ago to understand how that chemical conversation between the brain and other organs changes with age and how that might drive systemic aging. And then we accidentally backed into thinking about the brain-ovary conversation about 8 years ago. And really that changed the trajectory of my entire research focus. It also changed the trajectory of my entire career. I've moved on from academic science now to try to move this into a more practical space. But when you think about ovaries, most people immediately go to reproduction. But ovaries are not just reproductive organs, right? They are endocrine regulators. So they're much like the brain. They make chemical signals that they can use to communicate with almost every tissue in the female body. So they sit at the center of their own Wi-Fi signaling system. And they're essentially talking to almost every tissue in the female body. They talk to brain and bone and heart and liver and immune cells. That's something that's really important to understand, is that hormones like estrogen and progesterone are actually signaling to different kinds of immune cells. And we know that women in general tend to have, stronger innate and stronger adaptive immune responses than men. There's a lot to unpack there, but comparatively speaking, understanding sex differences in immune function is going to help us understand really how to tackle not just autoimmune disorders, but how to really tackle all sorts of disorders that affect immune function. And when I talk about hormones, I think it's important to just point out that a hormone is just any chemical that can communicate in your body over long distances. So when I say hormone in the context of female biology, people always think of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and a few other steroid hormones. But there are literally hundreds, probably thousands of other chemicals that your body uses for this kind of Wi-Fi communication. And ovaries, while they definitely produce those steroid hormones, particularly estrogen and progesterone, testosterone, they also produce other signaling molecules that we don't yet really understand. And so I'm super excited about understanding that bidirectional communication between ovaries and immune cells. And as a way to think about downstream consequences in female biology that have to do with like immune surveillance, metabolic health, neural inflammation. These are all places where if we understand how the system works, then we have levers basically to intervene and to think about how ovarian function, immune function, and how they're connected is important, not just for reproductive health, but also for like the chronic disease landscape that we're talking about and that really defines how women age. So thank you for having me here.
Oh my gosh, I'm fascinated by the work that you're doing and by the questions that need to be asked and by the direction that this will take. And so we'll come back in a minute because I've got a handful of questions for you. But Christina, Let me switch to you. You and I have partnered, and happily so. I'm delighted to have you in my orbit. You are our partner at Lightstone Ventures, and you focus on investments in the biopharma sector. And we always like combining all parts of the pipeline on our discussions. So having you to be able to talk to us about this sector is critically important. Not the least of which is that you've spent probably more than 20 years in it. You know, broadly speaking, I know that you're intrigued, and I know that your field is neuroscience, and you were a scientist before you went to the dark side, I guess. But we know that there's a tremendous outsized opportunity both in neurodegenerative diseases and autoimmune diseases. And I would love for you to speak just broadly about what that investment white space looks like. And then we can drill down after into some specific areas that you're excited by.
Yeah, Carolee, thank you so much for having me, and I'm thrilled to be here amongst some luminary scientists here who are really going to drive the next stage of innovation in understanding sex-specific differences. It's a mouthful in autoimmune diseases and immunology broadly. I did join the dark side, I guess you could say, but I like to say as a scientist, I'm shedding light on the dark side and I stay close to the scientific roots. Whenever we're investing in companies, look, science and medicine are at the forefront, and we combine that, of course, with the business aspects, making sure that we can readily identify the patients that we intend to treat, can develop those, products for those patients, and that there's a payer and market opportunity, of course. And look, in the case here, autoimmune disease, it represents a very, very hot area for investment, just broadly speaking. As an early stage investor, but across the board, not early stage only, but even late stage investors are very focused on this area. I think the piece that we're shedding light on is that the reality that a large percentage of the market is female, right? And I think it is our responsibility and accountability as investors, as board members, as managers, as entrepreneurs, as innovators, to ensure that we are generating and studying our innovative ideas, right, across males and females, and understanding whether there are differences and opportunities and making sure we're targeting the right patients. So what is it? That's precision medicine, right? And we have been very, very focused as investors on precision medicine in a lot of different therapeutic areas, in particular oncology. We've made great strides. We've understood biomarkers. We've understood how to enroll the right patients for our therapies. And now it's time that we apply those lessons and those scientific disciplines, right, to areas like autoimmune and neuro, right? I think we're highlighting two key areas that are just in need of that. So, with that, I'll start with just a few comments generally about autoimmunity and the opportunities there. I'd like to highlight later maybe a few investment examples that we've made that I think are important, that are what I think of as lower hanging fruit, going after targets and biology that we actually do understand, and doing that in a way that's tailored and understanding the female patient versus the male patient. But I want to just highlight that there have been some wins in autoimmunity on the therapeutic side. And they're not products that are simple or straightforward to administer. But, we know of CAR T cell therapies, right? Engineered cells that have been used now in large part to cure a lot of cancers and blood-based cancers. I think the important news that has come over the last decade is that now CAR Ts are being used in the context of treating autoimmune diseases. And there's a rich data set right now where MS patients, lupus patients, I think more recently we're seeing scleroderma patients are responding and being effectively cured. And I'm very, I want to be responsible about using that word cure here. But it is in the context of seeing durable response and remission of autoimmune phenotype, right? And autoimmune disease. So I think it's an important thing to highlight, just to say, look, the science is moving, right? We are moving forward. That wasn't necessarily done in a sex-specific way. So I want to be specific about that. But I do want to say that the science is translating to very innovative, impactful medicines. I think for us to go to the next level on sex-specific aspects here, I think it's really important that the incorporation of patient samples in all of our research, in all of our approaches gets incorporated as early as possible. The other good news there is there's a number of biobanks that are on the rise. I'm sure your respective institutions can highlight this maybe later in this panel. But I think this is a very important effort. And one example is actually out of Europe. And I think we need to actually acknowledge that the Europeans are making great headway on some of the patient-derived data sets that are big data sets. The British Biobank just announced, right, that they're now going to be including electronic medical records tagged to the data sets that they have. These are rich data sources, right, that now we have a problem in front of us, and that's how are we going to tackle those data sets, but ask the right questions about sex-specific differences or opportunities so that great scientists among us here can pursue translating those data sets into true medicines and products that are going to impact patients. So I think it's important to incorporate patient-derived data in some form, patient samples. And I'm seeing a number of companies right now in that space, and that dovetails into this idea of precision immunology therapeutics, which I think is a very important area for investment, very important area for the future. I want to acknowledge as well, and while Lightstone does not invest in diagnostics, I know that there's probably a number of investors on this call and beyond, the importance of diagnostics, of really working through the biomarker work that's being led by a number of pioneers in the space now, targeting blood and autoantibody panels, looking at proteomic and epigenetic biomarkers, translating that data into diagnostics is going to be a very important area for investment, as well as incorporating kind of a reproductive health aware approach to a number of these approaches, because we know that while women make up the largest part of this patient population, it's also largely women of reproductive age, right? So 20 to 40s are this prime time for diagnosis, unfortunately, for autoimmunity. And then that becomes a barrier to entry sometimes in terms of enrolling these women in clinical trials. And so we have to be mindful of that, but as well be open-minded in terms of how we go about designing some of these trials and allowing for women to participate so that we can generate the critical data that we need. And then finally, I'll just make a comment that I just recently participated in a conversation even last week around a large AI-driven panel and platform approach to combing patient data. And it's interesting, but the microbiome and epigenetic aspects associated with microbiome and differences in the microbiome are coming up again as potential driver for disease. And I'm going to bet it might play a role in sex-specific differences and ways to also delineate different patients who might be more responsive or less responsive depending on microbiome changes. And then it layers in a few complexities. For investors, there's been a lot of misses in the microbiome space, but I think that if you use that data appropriately to identify patients again, and potentially new targets and how pathways are reacting to the microbiome, it might be an opportunity for new targets to be identified there. So I'll take a pause there and come back to some maybe more specific examples, but that's just a high level view.
Yeah, well, thanks, Christina. Fantastic. And the role of AI obviously is going to be incredibly impactful as we move forward. And that'll be a session on its own, but I can imagine the implications that it's going to have for studying any of these areas. And we're all very focused on that. Vicki, thank you, first of all, for joining us. And as the director of the Office of Autoimmune Disease Research, I would love for you to share a little bit about your background. And then from your vantage point at NIH, where are you seeing the greatest opportunities to better align autoimmune disease research with the reality that the majority of patients are women? And where are you seeing meaningful momentum? Because I think we're all feeling this momentum, and you've been at this for a while, and I would love to hear your perspective on the changes that have taken place recently.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on this webinar. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and share some updates on what's been going on in the life of the office. As you know, the Office of Autoimmune Disease Research is a relatively new office at NIH. We were formed at the request of Congress. They directed the NIH in the Congressional Appropriations Act of 2023 to formed this office, specifically asked for it to be within the Office of Research on Women's Health, and so that's where we sit, and tasked us with 6 congressional directives, the first of which was to coordinate the development of an NIH-wide strategic plan for autoimmune disease research. I am pleased to report that was published this past summer. If you don't have a copy, I can send you one, and we're happy to have this live and on the website for people to take a look at. There is a quick one-pager if people want to look at the one-page version for people to download that gives you a kind of summary overview of the priorities and strategic objectives of this strategic plan. But when we put this together, we did it really collectively across NIH. All of the institutes and centers that support autoimmune disease research participated in the planning. We collected information from our community. We hosted a number of roundtables and then also took information through a request for information from the community and kind of merged that all into what became the strategic plan. And we did it with a very forward-looking lens, thinking about what do not only the scientists, but also the patients of 2030 and 2050 want us to be doing today that will impact the future of autoimmune disease research. We have a number of other priorities and objectives that we were directed to work on by Congress, and we are diligently working on those, one of which was to look across NIH at what's currently being funded. So we've taken a deep dive into the existing portfolio, and then to really stimulate opportunities for collaboration and innovation across both the NIH and then also across our community, and what can the office do to support initiatives for autoimmune disease research across the whole research continuum.
Well, I know you've been really focused on driving all of these objectives that you've set out, and we're appreciative of that. We'll come back. I've got a series of questions, but let me segue back to Sonia and ask you. Everyone talks about precision medicine. How is it that we're going to have precision medicine if we're not studying women, or if women are not part of the data sets that they need to be part of? And I guess I'd ask you, what kind of changes, Sonia, whether in funding, collaboration models, or data infrastructure, what would most accelerate the integration of sex-based biology into autoimmune research?
Absolutely. Those are 2 fabulous questions. To address your first question, Carolee, how precision medicine if we're not being precise? And that is the central, illogical kind of thing that we're dealing with. You can't have precision medicine if we're not seeing the whole picture. Just to tell you a small anecdote, when we first started our Sex Differences in the Immune System initiative at LJI, I was asked a question. Why are you interested in biological factors that only affect 50% of the population? And that kind of shocked me at the time. And I said, well, no, not really. Like, why? I can turn that around and say, how can we understand a disease if we only have 50% of the picture? And if we see the whole picture, maybe we can understand diseases for men and for women. And that's really about what it is understanding the whole picture. I mean, to give you an example, there's only one drug that I know of, and forgive me if I'm saying something wrong there, and that's beta blockers that are prescribed differently between men and women because women metabolize them differently. Beta blockers are given for regulating blood pressure. And that's just one example, but that tells us that there's likely so many more points of precision that we're missing because we are not tailoring even established therapeutics to men and women and their differences in their biology, as well as new therapeutics and cures. So to bring back your initial point, precision medicine must take into account the biology and the biology of the X and Y, if you will. And you talked about accelerating, and I guess I'll just say something really simple. It just has to be more is more. And I'm so delighted that there is this new center at the NIH for autoimmunity, because more and more, we talk about trickle down. I feel like if we accelerate at the research phase, at the translational phase, at the clinical commercial phase. There'll be trickle down, there'll be trickle up, and we just need to do more. Christina was right. We're doing it in cancer. We've done it in cancer. Some of those immune therapies like CAR T cells, and other, like inflammatory regulators that are used for patients who are getting immunotherapy, those can cross. And so we can do this. We just need more.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there's I think a fair amount of momentum now to accelerate the conversation, the dialogues, and the actions that are taking place. The other drug that I'm aware of that there is a different dosage for men and women, and it was one that was determined a number of years ago, is Ambien, because women were driving with their kids and having accidents. And so that historically has been for a number of years at a lower dosage, fortunately. I'm sure there are others, but I'm aware of the beta blockers. Jennifer, let me switch back to you, and let's talk a little bit about reproductive biology, which has been studied separately from systemic health. And so how is that changing? Is it changing? And what does the emerging science really tell us about the role then of reproductive aging and what it might play in immune regulation, since that's what basically I think you're trying to figure out, and about chronic disease risk? What role does all of this ovarian aging play, and how do you see this in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first we have to sort of step back and reframe. Well, you can talk about reproductive aging, which is intrinsic aging in reproductive organs that really impacts fertility. And that is not the conversation that we want to have right now. What we want to talk about, and we're calling it ovarian aging just to get away from calling them reproductive organs, because I do think that, and I've said this many times, but calling them reproductive organs really does silo women's health into this lens of fertility and reproduction only, and sort of makes it small when we're really talking about something that impacts half the population and that is not necessarily linked to fertility. So ovarian aging is really just this idea that if what I said before, if you believe me, that ovaries are sitting at the center of this really complex signaling network that is, essentially has a role to play in almost every piece of your physiology. And not just during aging. Ovaries are important for health across a woman's lifespan. And so I call them the architects of health in female bodies. And the key fact that we need to acknowledge is that ovaries age faster than the rest of the tissues in the female body. And that drives this health span disparity that we see between males and females, right? Women have shorter health span than males. They spend more time at the end of their lives in poor health. And that is directly because ovaries start aging when a woman is in her late 20s, early 30s. And that is not an age where we typically talk about aging, right? You don't think about a woman in her 20s as being aged. That's something we associate with someone who's decades older. But your ovaries are starting to age when the rest of your tissues are functioning at peak performance. And so the key here is to try to understand why ovaries age faster than the rest of the tissues in the female body. And, this is foundational. We don't understand why that happens. And we certainly don't understand all of the downstream consequences that are happening at the systemic level. But, that's a pretty staggering gap when you consider, that ovarian aging is going to impact every woman who makes it to midlife and beyond. And, the immune consequences of what's happening both during, the first few decades of life, but then in the second half of a woman's life, it really does set the trajectory for health across the lifespan. And so for me, I think, all of these things are intertwined, and really, removing the silos. So right now, I think we have the opportunity to make a lot of progress in women's health, because there's a huge data gap for sure. And there has been a huge gap in addressing these problems, but we're now seeing a really beautiful and wonderful increase in the number of people who are interested in addressing this problem. But as we move forward, I think, these longitudinal studies that we all want to see happen, we need to think about tracking not just things like ovarian aging, but also immune markers, and not in separate silos, but together, and think about how they're impacting, how they're going back and forth and impacting each other, right? So, I mean, in women, fluctuating estrogen, and not just during perimenopause and menopause, but across the menstrual cycle, during pregnancy, and all of these places that that estrogen and other ovarian hormones fluctuate or decline as they do during menopause, that can directly tune immune activity, right? It can, higher estrogen is associated with different antibody production and increased regulatory T cells. And there's just a lot of things that we know about how ovarian hormones impact the immune system that I think if we dig deeper there, we'll be able to think better about how to dampen inflammation with age or potentially impact autoimmune disorders in a way that's really profound.
Everyone's obviously fascinated by the idea of healthy aging and certainly healthy longevity and long lifespan. And it appears to me that a lot of our tech bros are doing all kinds of interesting ways to stave off aging. Have you had any aha moment as you're doing all of this research? Not so much that all of a sudden you're going to tell us what to do to not become old, but rather that you were shocked by, that you were surprised by, that you had not anticipated?
Yeah. Well, let's see. Honestly, the biggest aha moment for me was just stepping back and understanding that when we talk about ovarian function, that it's really, it's important at every age, right? If your ovaries aren't working properly, at any age, whether you're 10 or 90, that uncovers different health risks. And which health risks are uncovered depends on who you are as an individual. And so just understanding that and then bringing that lens to think about female biology, starting for a girl who's 10, and understanding that there are signals, like there are measurable signals, things not things that we have to wait 10 years for research to uncover, but things that we know about now in modern medicine that can be measured, that would give women, information about their health, could help them, plan. We don't necessarily know how to intervene. We don't yet have solutions that are going to change the trajectory of a disease that we don't yet know the drivers of. But there are markers and measurable things that we can look at that will, for example, in a girl who's 10, might predict future polycystic ovarian syndrome, and that might then give them information about when they might want to start thinking about family planning, if that's something that they're interested in, or that might, if they have markers for PCOS and are diagnosed early, that women who have PCOS are much more likely to have metabolic disease later in life. And so there's just a lot of information that we miss right now that I think could be brought into a better use in the current medical system. And it's crazy to me. It's wild that we're talking about 50% of the population and we're still here, talking about blood markers that we haven't, really taken advantage of.
Well, you will, and that's why we're excited about your work. It occurs to me that often when I'm talking with people about the health of women or women's health, depending on which title you want to use, it immediately goes to reproductive or maternal health, the conversation, rather than, and we know that less than 5% of conditions that affect women are reproductive in nature. That leaves us, Christina, back to our conversation always of the 95% opportunity in all the other areas, and in particular, as we know, in autoimmune and neurodegenerative diseases. But a lot of people still, and a lot of investors, as you and I know, still have grossly underestimated what this opportunity is. So let's get a little more specific. What evidence or breakthroughs or investments have you seen that really are unlocking either, how are we unlocking either greater capital in the space, or how are we making investments that in fact are having immediate impact?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I'd like to believe with the amount of dollars going into autoimmune oriented companies and then the strategics that are buying them out. I mean, just yesterday, Aura Medicines announced, or Oro Medicines, excuse me, I always say Aura, Oro Medicines announced that Gilead's acquiring them for $2.2 billion. Okay, and a good chunk of that is upfront. I think it's like $1.5 billion is upfront. They are a T-cell engager company, right, in early clinical stages, I don't know how they're factoring in, sex-based aspects into their clinical trials. And again, maybe folks on this call can talk a little bit about where T cells might be unique in males versus females, or whether it's, maybe applicable to all. But the point is, there's a lot of interest in addressing the huge unmet need that exists across autoimmune diseases. I thought I'd give a specific example where I'm involved, and I'm chair of the board of a company called Cythera. So it's a company that is a small molecule focused company. The platform is a kind of quantum physics and AI machine learning platform that allows them to pursue different targets with the idea of pursuing targets where only antibodies or biologics have been available. So we're going after largely validated targets clinically, but now bringing the opportunity of a small molecule oral drug to patients. And I think this is important because the first product that we're going after is actually a TNF inhibitor. And we all know that the TNFs make up probably the largest market of drugs out there for autoimmune patients. There's a lot of different flavors of biologics available against TNF. And we know that women represent, again, the vast majority of diseases where anti-TNF conditions exist. So we're talking about like rheumatoid arthritis, talking about psoriasis, we're talking about Sjogren's and beyond. IBD as well, where in IBD maybe men fare worse in general, but again, still affects women in a big way. What we know, and what I asked of the company, we spent some time on this, and we're early, okay? So, and I think this is where it's on the investors and board members to work closely with management teams on these questions of sex differences or sex opportunities. We always start early thinking about what's the target profile, okay? What is a target product profile? What does success look like for our product? And what we did was we went through an exercise of putting the female patient in the line of focus for answering that question, okay? With a oral small molecule drug available against TNF, what would our aim be? What does success look like for women? Well, in order to answer that question, we looked at, well, where are the opportunities or gaps with existing biologics? And so what we know now is that women respond less well in general to TNF inhibitors. They discontinue the TNF inhibitors, so these biologics, earlier, largely because they have a higher adverse event rate, okay? And this is largely around injection site reactions, which, as we discussed earlier, we, as women, tend to have a more robust antibody response than men. And maybe in large part because we have higher B cells for women specifically, but then we end up having these anti-drug antibody reactions or skin reactions, right, to the biologics. We also tend to be underrepresented, obviously, in the clinical trials. But then we also understood that the biologics are kind of used later in disease course because, again, diagnosis is coming a little bit later for women. So what did we think about with an oral? What is the opportunity we're providing women? So one is elimination of these site injection AEs, right? Because we will not have these direct site reactions given it's an oral drug. The other thing we thought about is that in general, women have a lower average body weight than men and tend to be have a higher body fat fraction. And so the pharmacokinetics of biologics starts to get funky here. You have a fixed dose for women, we talked about dosing earlier, and men alike. In the case of a small molecule oral drug, we can offer different doses and allow for adjustable dosing depending on weight. So that's a little bit of an opportunity here that we're also thinking about. The other piece is trying to intervene earlier in the treatment paradigm so that we can try to get at protecting joints and other aspects of aging that come with autoimmune disease. And again, it is the convenience factor. I hate to use the word convenience because it's not just about convenience. It's about trying to intervene earlier so you can help them in their disease sooner. But an oral allows you to do that and more simply. And then the other piece that we're very hyper-focused on as well, which I think is very important, is access and adherence. So orals are easier to take, right? Compliance is easier versus injectables or IVs, you have to go to the doctor's office, you have to go to an infusion site. It requires sometimes cold chain distributions, right? It's a refrigerated or frozen product. So you have to go in, and not everybody has access to these sites, right? So there's limited and there's some barriers to entry for several women who might be in rural communities and so forth. And so an oral might be just an easier access point for women. So again, this is to not just push Cythera. I think the point is it's an example of how we can partner around known biology that we know works, right? While we're in parallel looking for new biomarkers, we're looking for new opportunities and things to pursue scientifically. You can go after the existing and what we know, but now try to design your products to be tailored to address some of these gaps that might be more prevalent in women.
Yeah, thank you. 51% of the population, 80% of the healthcare decisions, 85% of the spending, and we're still trying to figure out how to tailor products for this vast marketplace, which is fantastic. Better late than never. But there's still, look how much work there still is left that we have to focus on. Thanks for the example, and excited to hear how patient-centered it sounds. Vicki, talking about patient-centered, I'd be curious to know what you think the biggest opportunities are to strengthen the connection, because I'm sure you see it between scientific discovery, clinical application, and real-world impact on autoimmune disease. And how is your office really? What are you the most excited about in terms of either what has happened in the past couple of years or what you're looking towards?
Oh, great. It's a really exciting time in autoimmune disease research, and we're sort of sitting on the cusp of the future coming into reality. And I think that we need to look across this whole spectrum of diagnosis earlier, prevention, treatment, getting treatments to patients more effectively, and then potentially even cure. And we know this is possible. We know this is possible because we do have biomarkers for some diseases, some better than others, but we know that those biomarkers are definable for many diseases if we invest in the research that we need to do to understand those markers of disease. We also know that prevention is possible. So we've had some great advances from the type 1 diabetes field, where we've been able to intervene with an immunosuppressant early in the course of pre-diabetes. So these are relatives of children who have confirmed type 1 diabetes, who have developed autoantibodies, indicating they're at risk of diabetes, but before they've developed full-blown diabetes, and use of a monoclonal antibody against CD3, which blocks a molecule in the immune system, we're able to prevent progression to full-blown diabetes and delay progression to full-blown diabetes. That's paradigm shifting. If we can do it for type 1 diabetes, the likelihood is there are going to be targets that would be similarly receptive in other autoimmune diseases. And so I think it's, taken us from this pie in the sky, is this really possible? This is tangibly possible. We need to better understand those potential targets across the 140 different autoimmune diseases. And I think it's really important as we articulate this problem, we also articulate these diseases, while individually some of them are quite rare, collectively they are extremely common. So there are more than 50 million people living with autoimmune disease in the United States alone. When you collectively take all of these diseases, it's the most common cause of chronic disease in the United States. And the science is finally perfectly poised to really change some of these treatment paradigms. In terms of the potential for future cures, I agree with Christina that we are on the cusp of really exciting times with some of these engineered cell therapies. But being able to deploy those across the 140 different autoimmune diseases to patients across America is going to need a different level of investment. And I think, it is all possible, and I hope it's possible over the course of the next 10, 15, 20 years, but I do think it realistically is going to take a different level of investment.
Absolutely. Well, it's exciting to hear. In 2023, WHAM celebrated the 30th anniversary of the 1993 Revitalization Act, at which point guidelines were provided that women be part of clinical trials and research. It wasn't until 2016 that female mice were included, and then we know that that isn't even necessarily happening at the rate that it is supposed to. I guess what I'd like to ask everyone, during that time, we developed a concept called 3 not 30. Like, I'm not waiting another 30 years. What is it that we're doing in the next 3 years to really create change? And I guess I would like to ask each of you, kind of rapid fire, what you see as the most exciting therapies, diagnostics, devices being developed, any one of those, in the autoimmune immunology space in the next 3 years. I'm not waiting 30. Sonia, I know this is like off the top of my head, but just all of you are on the front line. So what's top of mind for you? What are you the most excited about?
I'm excited about the kind of nutraceutical and metabolism-focused supplements. And I know that's still a little bit very heterogeneous space, but I'm really excited about what I'm seeing about anti-inflammatory metabolites and natural products. For example, anti-inflammatory lipids that we could take orally in order to dampen chronic inflammation. And I feel like that's an everyday change that if we just understood more, we could translate into therapeutics.
Excellent. Jennifer?
I think we're moving into a place where we can have better, like, sex stratified immune profiling at scale. We have all this amazing technology now to map immune states with pretty extraordinary precision, but we haven't systematically applied that to track how women's immune landscape changes across any data point. And I also think, this is a little bit further out, but I think that, we've touched on microbiome a few times here. There's so much rich data coming out every day about how your gut microbiome can actually influence the levels of circulating estrogen, for example, in your body. And those are amazing drug targets potentially. So those are the kinds of things that are coming down the line that I'm super excited about. I also hope, just coming to back to your comment about the 1993 clinical trial inclusion of women, I think I would really like to see clinical trial designs start to routinely account for menopausal status as a biological variable, because we know that age of natural menopause can span up to 14 years and be called normal. And, physiology changes so dramatically at age of natural menopause. And so there's a lot of noise that's associated with clinical design or clinical trial design that I think could be easily sorted if we kept track of. It's such an easy thing to track. Age of natural menopause is a biological variable, so let's do that.
Such a great call out. Christina?
Yeah, I'm going to echo that last comment. I mean, I think this is low-hanging fruit, folks. I mean, we can run these trials like this. FDA is not going to say no, right, to tracking that way. I really highly doubt that. This is about getting more data, being more specific, being safe, right, and making sure that we are studying efficacy in a safe context, right, for all. So I can't agree more. I think those are things that are just really tangible. Look, I think I am very excited about the biology around immune reset and this idea of resetting the immune system in the context of autoimmune diseases, so that you play back the clock, you play back these cells, you tell them, look, you're not diseased anymore. And that's a very basic way of explaining it. But the CAR Ts, the T cell engagers, many of these mechanisms are coming forward and showing promise. And now it's, again, I hope people start incorporating women in those trials and make sure that they're incorporating women in those trials and studying, again, the sex piece of it. And then I'd say I'm going to be following Sonia and Jennifer, your work, and then continued work around biomarkers and making sure that we are really diving into either biomarkers that delineate patients or biomarkers that allow us to track disease, so that we know when to intervene and when best to have impact. And I think that we are on the brink of a lot of that with all the data that's out there. We have a lot to learn from existing therapies that are out there, and it's just a matter of people pointing their focus and time and energy to those data sets and asking the right questions and pulling it up.
Fantastic. Vicky, can you wrap that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to everyone today, what really strikes me is this amazing data point that I was told the other day by the director of the All of Us program, which is All of Us, which is an opportunity for anyone in the United States to enroll in research. You self-refer to the program, has more women enrolled than men because women want to be in research. And I think we have to hold that really close. If we start with what matters to patients, we're going to find answers to important questions. Research is rarely a straight line. Setbacks are common, but our patients will tell us where to go. And people really want to be a part of this journey alongside us. And I think now is the time for that to happen. I think through partnership, every study, even negative studies, can add to a knowledge base that moves the whole field forward. And people living with autoimmune diseases and those at risk should know that their experiences are really important for us to understand in order to move the research needle forward.
Well, all of you are amazing, and I can't thank you enough for your insights and for your leadership. And to each of you for joining us for this very timely and important conversation. You brought so much knowledge to us all, and I'm very, very grateful. I also want to recognize our incredible partners and collaborators whose support makes this work possible. And following today's discussion, we'll share a recording with everyone who has registered, so they'll be able to catch up. And thank you really to each of you for participating and for keeping us on track and up to date in the world of autoimmune and immune. I have often said that meaningful change doesn't happen by chance, it happens by choice. And it happens, I think, when people like us come together to shape a future that we want to see. So thank you for being with us, and thank you to all of you today who listened to us and for the role that you play in what comes next. Looking forward to many more. Thank you.